Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me.
Natalie stood at the edge of the darkened terrace, her gaze fixed on the horizon of Shadow Star. The planet, shrouded in twilight, thrived on secrecy and shadows. Even the light that trickled through the thick atmosphere felt muted, as though it, too, carried with it the weight of unsaid things. As the Shadow Queen, Natalie was the epitome of control. She ruled not just with authority but with precision, her ability to manipulate both secrets and emotions keeping her in power. Everyone on Shadow Star knew their place. They kept their secrets close, their emotions hidden. It was a planet of whispers, and Natalie, the undisputed master of them all. But beneath her calm exterior, a restlessness had grown. Despite all her power, Natalie felt an emptiness she couldn't explain. Shadow Star was a world of controlled emotions, where vulnerability was considered weakness. She had never experienced what humans called love or compassion, at least not in the way they did. Her people prized detachment, seeing it as a strength, and yet, there was something compelling about the way humans lived, messy, uncontrolled, but undeniably passionate. For years, she had watched them from afar, intrigued by their chaotic emotions and the way they navigated the complexities of their inner worlds. Men in particular fascinated her. Their struggles with identity, their search for meaning, what drove them to such emotional extremes, what made them so unpredictable and, at times, so fragile. And so, Natalie made a decision that would alter the course of her life. She would go to Earth, not as the ruler of Shadow Star, but as an ordinary human, someone who could move among them unnoticed. She would disguise herself as a psychologist, someone who helped others untangle their emotions. If there was any way to understand humans, it would be through this most intimate form of connection. With a sweep of her hand, the shadows around her obeyed, shifting and swirling like loyal subjects. Natalie's power wasn't just in her command of secrets but in the way she could manipulate the very essence of shadow itself. On Shadow Star, shadows were allied via entities that responded to their rulers, and Natalie, being the most powerful of them all, had long mastered the art of commanding them with a mere thought. In the blink of an eye, her figure dissolved into the shadows, traveling across the vast distances between worlds. When she re-emerged, she stood in the heart of Earth, her appearance transformed. No longer did she wear the dark, regal robes of her station. Instead, she looked human, her features softer, her demeanor less imposing. She had taken the form of Dr. Natalie Gray, a woman in her early 30s with a kind face and piercing eyes that held a depth few could understand. It was time to begin her exploration. The bustling streets of the city were a far cry from the hushed whispers of Shadow Star, and Natalie found herself momentarily overwhelmed. The noise, the lights, the emotions, everything felt so alive, so broken bar exposed. Humans had no need to hide their emotions the way her people did. They wore them openly, sometimes in ways that made Natalie uneasy. She had rented a modest office in the quieter part of town, a place where she could conduct her sessions in peace. The walls were painted a soft, calming shade of blue, and the furniture was deliberately unremarkable. A bookshelf lined one wall, filled with volumes on psychology and the human-minded topics she had studied extensively, though never from the perspective of someone who had truly felt these emotions herself. Her first few clients were routine, each of them a puzzle of emotions that she unraveled with ease. Natalie could see through their facades in an instant, her shadow abilities allowing her to delve deeper into their minds than any human psychologist could ever dream. But it was all academic to her, an intellectual exercise. None of them sparked the deep connection she was seeking. And then came George. He walked into her office late on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, his expression haggard, eyes downcast. Natalie's first impression was that he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, his very presence tinged with sorrow. He sat down heavily in the chair across from her, his movements slow and deliberate, as though each one took immense effort. For a moment, Natalie simply observed him. There was something about George that intrigued her, Something in the way he carried himself. He was different from her other clients, a deeper, more complex. His aura was riddled with shadows, but not the kind she commanded. These were shadows of his own making, born from pain and loss. "George," she said softly, breaking the silence, "what brings you here today?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around the room, as if searching for something, or perhaps a way out, or maybe just the right words. His hands fidgeted in his lap, and Natalie could sense his hesitation. "I don't know where to start," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to start anywhere specific," Natalie replied. "We'll find the beginning together." That seemed to ease him, if only slightly. George took a deep breath and ran a hand through his dark, unruly hair. "I guess a broken bar. I've just been lost for a long time, and I'm tired of feeling this way." "Lost how?" Natalie asked, leaning forward, her gaze steady. George's eyes flickered to hers, and for the first time, she saw the depth of his struggle. "I don't know who I am anymore," he confessed. "I used to be broken bar someone, a psychologist, a researcher. I had it all figured out, but then a broken bar everything fell apart." He paused, and Natalie remained silent, giving him space to continue. "My work at broken bar, it was everything to me," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I studied the human mind, tried to understand why people feel the way they do, why they act the way they do. But now a broken bar, I don't even understand myself." Natalie could see the rawness in his words, the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide. His emotions were like an open wound, and yet, there was something about his pain that drew her in. She found herself wanting to help him, not just as a psychologist, but on a deeper level. Perhaps it was because, in him, she saw a reflection of her own search for meaning. "I think," George continued, "I've lost my sense of self. My work was everything, but now it feels hollow. I don't even know what I'm looking for anymore." Natalie's heart, usually so controlled and distant, felt a pang of something she hadn't anticipated. Compassion. Was this what it felt like? The need to reach out, to connect, not out of obligation but out of genuine care? "George," she said gently, "you're not alone in feeling this way. It's not unusual for people to lose themselves, especially when they've dedicated their lives to something that no longer fulfills them. But the fact that you are here, seeking help, shows that you still care, that you still want to find yourself." He nodded, though the look in his eyes remained clouded. "I just don't know where to start." "We'll figure it out together," Natalie said, her voice steady. "But first, I need you to trust me. I need you to be willing to let me in, even if it's uncomfortable." George hesitated, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean, let you in?" Natalie leaned back slightly, choosing her words carefully. "I want you to be honest with me, not just about the things you're struggling with on the surface, but the deeper things, the things you might not even want to admit to yourself." For a long moment, George was silent. Then, with a slow exhale, he nodded. "Okay, I'll try." In the weeks that followed, George became a regular in Natalie's office. Their sessions were intense, filled with moments of revelation and silence. He spoke of his struggles with self-worth, the pain of a relationship that had fallen apart, and the deep sense of failure that had followed him for years. Natalie, for her part, listened carefully, her shadow powers allowing her to navigate the depths of his emotions with ease. But as time went on, something unexpected began to happen. The more she explored George's emotions, the more she found herself drawn to him, and not just as a client, but as a person. His vulnerability, his pain, even his moments of hope, all stirred something inside her that she had never felt before. Human emotions were supposed to be chaotic, something her people avoided at all costs. But now, experiencing them through George, Natalie found them to be broken bar beautiful, raw and unfiltered, yes, but also full of depth and meaning. She had spent her life mastering the art of control, but now, in the presence of someone who had lost control, She felt something she hadn't anticipated: empathy. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, Natalie found herself sitting alone in her office, her thoughts tangled in a way they had never been before. She had always been able to separate herself from her clients, viewing their emotions as puzzles to be solved, but with George, it was different. She cared about him, she wanted to see him heal, not just because it was her duty, but because it mattered to her. For the first time in her life, Natalie was beginning to understand what it meant to care for someone, to want the best for them, even if it meant facing uncomfortable truths, and that realization shook her to her core. Natalie sat in her dimly lit office, the room wrapped in silence after George's departure. Her eyes traced the fading light from the window, but her mind was miles away. The conversations with George had become more than therapy for him, they were therapy for her, too. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was crossing lines she had once sworn to protect. The boundary between her professional duty and the emotions she was beginning to experience was dissolving. Her hands rested on the arms of her chair, but the familiar sensation of control was slipping from her grasp. For so long, she had been the master of shadows, the keeper of secrets. On Shadow Star, emotions were something to be manipulated, controlled. Yet, here on Earth, they had a life of their own, unpredictable, chaotic, and impossible to ignore. George had unknowingly opened a door within her, and Natalie wasn't sure if she could or even wanted to close it. She had come to Earth to observe human emotions, to learn about them from a distance, but now, she was in the thick of it, living the very thing she had only intended to study. The night air outside her window was cool, and she watched as the shadows crept along the city streets below. The shadows had always been her companions, but now, they felt like a reminder of the life she was starting to question. She turned her gaze inward, letting the silence in the room wrap around her like a blanket. For the first time in her long existence, Natalie felt uncertain about her future. She had always known exactly what she was, what her role in the universe was supposed to be, but George had changed that. The way he struggled, the way he fought to understand himself, it had sparked something within her that felt alarmingly human. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She hadn't been expecting anyone this late. Rising from her chair, she crossed the room and opened the door. To her surprise, it wasn't one of her clients, it was one of the envoys from Shadow Star, standing tall and shadow-clad, their presence both familiar and unsettling. "Natalie," the envoy said, their voice cold and distant, "we need to talk." Her heart sank. She had known this moment would come, but not so soon. The envoy stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, the shadows bending slightly around their form. "You've been here too long," they said. "The council is concerned." Natalie folded her arms, trying to maintain the composure that had always come so naturally to her. "Concerned? About what?" "About your growing attachment to these humans. You've lost sight of your mission. Your role is to observe, to study, and not to get involved. Emotions are dangerous, Natalie, you know that." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't respond immediately. She knew the envoy was right, at least by Shadow Star's standards. Emotions were unpredictable, they could lead to chaos, to vulnerability, but what if that vulnerability was the very thing that made humans so fascinating? "I haven't lost sight of anything," she said finally, her voice steady. "I'm doing what I came here to do." The envoy's eyes narrowed. "No, you're not. You've become entangled with one of them. This man, George. Yeah, he's clouding your judgment." Natalie felt a flicker of defensiveness rise within her. "George is just a client. I'm helping him like I would help anyone." "Don't lie to yourself," the envoy snapped, their voice growing sharper. "You've allowed yourself to feel, you've let human emotions take hold of you, and now you're losing control." The accusation hit harder than Natalie had expected. Control had always been her strength, it was what made her who she was, and yet, the more time she spent on Earth, the more she questioned whether control was truly what she wanted. Was it possible that humans had something to teach here, something that went beyond mere observation? The council is giving you one last chance, the envoy continued. Return to Shadow Star, and cut ties with these humans, otherwise, you will face the consequences. Natalie's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The idea of returning to Shadow Star now, after everything she had experienced, felt suffocating. Could she really go back to a life where emotions were something to be feared, something to be hidden away? I'll think about it, she said quietly. The envoy didn't seem satisfied with her answer, but they nodded nonetheless. You don't have much time, the council won't wait forever. With that, the envoy turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Natalie alone once again. Days passed, but Natalie's mind remained troubled. She continued her sessions with George, but the weight of the council's ultimatum hung over her like a cloud. Each time she sat across from George, watching him pour his heart out, she couldn't help but feel the pull of her own emotions growing stronger. She had told herself that she was here to help him, that this was her duty as a psychologist, but now, it felt like so much more. One evening, after a particularly intense session, George lingered in her office longer than usual. He had been talking about his childhood, about the deep-rooted insecurities that had shaped him into the man he was today. Natalie had listened intently, offering her insights and guidance as always, but there was something different in the air tonight, something unspoken between them. George shifted in his seat, his eyes meeting hers in a way that felt more vulnerable than ever before. Natalie, he said softly, I've never told anyone this before, but a broken bar, I feel like I can trust you. Her heart skipped a beat. Trust was a powerful thing, especially in her line of work. She had built her career on the foundation of trust, on the idea that people could open up to her in ways they couldn't with anyone else. But this felt different. This felt a broken bar personal. You can trust me, George, she said, her voice steady but her emotions swirling beneath the surface. He hesitated, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. It's just a broken bar. I don't know who I am anymore. I've spent so much of my life trying to be what other people wanted me to be, but now, I feel like I'm losing myself. Natalie's heart ached for him, but she knew that part of what she was feeling was her own internal struggle. George's words echoed her own fears that she had been trying to suppress ever since the envoy's visit. She, too, was losing herself. The lines between who she was supposed to be and who she was becoming were blurring. I understand, she said quietly, more than you know. George looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? Natalie hesitated, the weight of her secret pressing down on her. For a moment, she considered telling him everything about Shadow Star, about her true identity, about the council's warning, but she couldn't. Not yet. I mean a broken bar. I've been where you are, she said, choosing her words carefully. I've felt that same sense of being lost, of not knowing who I am or what I want. It's not easy, but it's part of the journey. George nodded slowly, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Natalie, you've helped me more than you know. She forced a smile, but inside, her emotions were a storm. She wanted to help him, to be there for him, but how could she, when she couldn't even help herself? That night, Natalie sat alone in her apartment, the city lights flickering outside her window. She couldn't sleep, her mind was racing, filled with thoughts of George, of the envoy, of the decision she had to make. The council's ultimatum loomed over her like a shadow, but so did her feelings for George. It wasn't supposed to be this way. She had come to Earth to observe, to learn. She had never intended to get involved, to care, but now, she couldn't deny the truth any longer. She had fallen for him. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She had fallen in love with George. Love, it was a word that had never held much meaning for her before, but now, it felt like the most powerful thing in the universe. She had spent her entire life controlling emotions, keeping them at bay, but love, a broken bar love, was something she couldn't control. and that terrified her. Natalie closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She knew what the council would say. They would tell her that love was a weakness, that it would cloud her judgment and make her vulnerable, and maybe they were right, but for the first time in her life, she didn't care. Love wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. It was the very thing that made humans so remarkable, so resilient, and maybe, just maybe, it was the thing that would save her. As the night wore on, Natalie made her decision. She couldn't go back to Shadow Star, not now. She couldn't return to a life of emotional suppression, of control. She had tasted what it was like to feel, to care, and she couldn't give that up. The next day, she walked into her office with a sense of purpose. She had made her choice. She would stay on Earth. She would continue to help George, not just as a psychologist but as someone who cared about him deeply. And if the council wanted to punish her for that, so be it. When George arrived for his session, Natalie could see the change in him. He looked more at peace,